Steve, what planet are you on?
You know, I've asked that question of Steve many times.
That's so funny. I have to apologize in advance. My cat is definitely going to be part of the talk today, for the record.
Okay, we are, you know, we're all in favor of diversity, so even interspecies.
There we go. I know Daniel will be a big proponent of that. So she, for some reason, is attracted to, either it's me sitting and it's my lap, or yeah.
What is your cat's name?
Her name is Dia.
Dia.
Dia. She's an all-black cat, and I think she was a rescue. I foster cats. I've been fostering cats for like 25 years. And she was the only one so far that I couldn't give up. When I got her within 24 hours, I was like, how do I keep this one? Because she's just such a great cat. She's Manx, and she has this little tiny tail that wiggles like a dog. And so she just has so much character for a cat. But she's a little mouthy, as I like to say.
So it's not a planet.
What is it?
It is the comet Neowise from whenever it was, several months ago.
Yeah.
And this was the first really big success I had with my fancy scope, right? It was not visible to naked eye when I took this.
So I'm just trying to keep up, Steve. I'm just going to put this background on.
That's okay. Oh, nice.
Very funny.
That's a great background.
That's awesome. Are you like going through like a vein or something?
I think I'm just falling into the pit of overcommitment, as we like to call it.
Been there, done that. Yeah, I have this rule where I only allowed to have 5 main tasks that I'm doing. And I just noticed today that there's 5 main tasks and about 5 little things written next to it, so I won't feel guilty.
Yeah.
Not working. So it's all good.
So Steve, this is your own image that you've captured.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, 3 years ago, I guess, I'm a sort of an inveterate Indiegogo, Kickstarter nerd, and get sucked in far too many times. And actually, I don't think I've ever been totally disappointed, because you never know whether they're ever going to ship anything. Yeah. This one was so intriguing because I've always wanted to get sort of back into, astronomy. I've never been an astronomer, but very interesting and very relevant for the rest of my physics. This is like a very much next generation, backyard citizens telescope. It's 4.5 inch, I think, so not very large, but very sophisticated electronics.
Yeah.
The claim is you can view things you wouldn't, including deep space objects you would not be able to see from normal urban environments. And I can attest to this. This image is a testament to that. I live in so-called Bortle 8 sky area, which is the worst. next to the last worst. Yeah. And I couldn't even see this. I had no, I did this from my balcony, which, I'm being lazy instead of going to a nice clear spot, but I'll do that.
With your thousands of dollars of equipment, maybe that's yeah.
It's got a nice backpack with it, so it's okay. So I couldn't even see it. So this scope is so easy to use. I mean, you point it at the sky, and you hit a button, and it figures out where it's pointing to. And once you've done that, once it's locked in, it knows where it is in the universe. You can either enter the name if it's in the database, or simply the right ascension and declination of the object, and it'll slew to that object, and boom, here it is. I mean, it was an incredible experience, really.
That is cool.
And you can't quite see the tail. The tail had deteriorated by this point, but it's there. I had to do quite a bit of post-processing to get this to show up.
Awesome.
So that was probably TMI, Ken, but thank you for asking.
And Tabitha, if I may,
Yeah.
I can't even remember last time you and I spoke, but you have proud Norwegian roots, am I to surmise, from that flag on your wall?
I teach in Norway normally in the summers.
Okay.
I teach research methods in Bergen, Norway, and have been doing so for the past 3 years. This will be the first year I don't get to do it. So, yeah. So
I have good colleagues.
Yeah.
Well, I have good colleagues up in Tromsø.
Oh, yeah.
And I just a quick anecdote. We had a conference in December that was in Umeå, Sweden, which is not far, just south of the Arctic Circle.
Yep.
And everybody was, kind of whining about why did they pick December to have this conference. It was an anniversary that had existed,
Yeah.
and so they honored the anniversary. And then, but the people from Tromsø said, "What are you all complaining about? We came south to attend this conference."
I have been to Tromsø for
Yeah.
a conference during the middle of the winter. And
Oh, so there you go.
It was it was a transcendental experience for many reasons.
Hopefully you saw the Northern Lights or something.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sun never came up, basically. So.
Yeah, I mean, when they're pulling out chainsaws to cut paths in the snow.
Yeah.
To get to the doorway.
They want to make sure that the entrances to the bars are open.
They always are. They always are.
Well, let's see. I'm going to go a little less intergalactic here. Let me just change my background.
Hey, Daniel.
Hello.
Yeah. Hey, Daniel. I was fiddling with my screen. We still have like another 5 minutes, so we'll let people join.
Great. Yeah, just wanted to connect and make sure I was all ready to go.
Yeah, that's great.
My cat's happy that I'm giving a talk to him, so I can sit still. She's down here. This will be my first talk with a cat on my lap. I feel like an evil, like tyrant of some sort, like I should be petting my cat and being like, whoa.
Like Austin Powers, Dr. Evil.
Well, I think that was a play on the old Bond movies for number one. Number one had the white cat, I think.
That's right, the white cat.
Yeah.
She's black, so I must be good then. So.
Yeah, there you go.
And just a quick, I guess, mechanical thing. Both Tabitha and I have been made co-hosts because we're going to actually be going back and forth between who's presenting. So I just wanted to make sure we had.
I think Austin's going to be on the call. Can you go ahead and just try to share your screen now, just to take? When he sets this up, I've always asked him to make sure basically anybody can share their screen. Okay, it looks like, and how about you?
That's me.
Daniel, can you, if Tabitha unshares?
Oh, somebody unshared for me.
Yeah, that was me.
Oh, okay. That, when we do it this way, so we don't have to finesse it after the fact.
Right.
The problem is that if you're on the call, you can commandeer the screen. So we're gonna rely on everybody to be on their best behavior. So.
Right.
So you should be able to see mine, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
and we can take turns sharing our screen, or we can just, one of us can move the slides along. It's really, what do you think would be best, Ken?
Are you going to be going back and forth?
So we split up the slides so we can kind of describe the slides we do better.
Okay, but is there going to be just one transition?
Yeah, there's one set of slides.
No. I mean, but you're going to hand off once. You're not going to hand it back again. Like
three times. 3 times was what we had thought about. But Tabitha, if you want to just, we've already gone over this. Tabitha, you can just run the whole thing. I mean, you know where we're stopping, etc.
Yeah,
you know where the slides are.
I can run the slides.
Yeah.
The talking in the middle anyway. So.
Okay. Tabitha, if you don't mind driving the bus, that would be maybe just minimize the little technical thing. So great.
Got it.
Okay, we're still, I think, a minute or two away, so let's give people a chance to come on. Welcome everybody who's already joined us. And let's see. Okay, we're quickly growing. Maybe when we hit 20, which I don't think will be hard in the next 30 seconds, but we're up to 19. I feel like I'm doing one of those telethons. Can we get like an NPR fundraiser or something? Can we just get one more caller? Okay, well, it's, excuse me, it's 12 o'clock. And so maybe in the interest of giving Tabitha and Daniel all the time that they need, I think I'm just going to go ahead and start. I have very few preliminary things I'd like to just start with, and then I will turn it over to Tabitha and Daniel. So welcome everybody. So just a quick introduction. So I'm Ken Smith. I'm the director of Nexus, and I'm also a faculty member in Family Consumer Studies. And this year we started this series that we're calling Dialogue on Disparities, and this is our second presentation. Some of you may have enjoyed the first presentation last semester, so this is the first one for this semester. And so we're really pleased to have Daniel and Tabitha here. Before I do a very, very short introduction to give them all the time that they need, I would just maybe do the usual housekeeping things. If you could just make sure you mute your mic. And if you have questions, I maybe just put those in the chat. And then when we have time at the end, I'll just try to go through them in the order in which they appear. And if I see a trend, I'll kind of join them together. And then the other thing I would like to mention is that we have 3 other scheduled talks, one each for February, March, and April. And I think some of you should have received a flyer that describes those. And they range from the Fair and Equitable Societies talk in February by Daryl Butt, who's the Dean of Minds and Earth Sciences, and Michelle Debbink, who's an OBGYN doc who's studying disparities in maternal morbidity. And then David Curtis is in my own department, who will be describing recent racial events and their effect on well-being. So we have some, in addition to this interesting talk today, we have some others that are also fascinating in the coming months. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn the time over to Daniel Mendoza and Tabitha Benney. I think hopefully everybody can see the title slide, and I am just going to turn it over to you guys. And thank you again for presenting your work.
Great. Thank you for having us, and thank you to everyone who is attending the call today. I see that it's being recorded, so it'll be great to be able to share that with those who couldn't attend. I'd like to just start by talking about what a great opportunity it is to really be discussing this as part of the Nexus series of talks. We always like to start by saying a big thanks to everyone who's been a partner here. The Office of Research at the U, the 3I Initiative that provide the funding for this study, Nexus, of course, for hosting, the GCSE, and U of U Health. So, quick introduction. I am a visiting assistant professor in Student Metropolitan Planning. I'm also a research assistant professor in atmospheric sciences, and adjunct assistant professor in pulmonary division at the School of Medicine and research associate at Nexus. My background, if we want to kind of look at where I started, it was more of a broad basis in terms of looking at atmospheric sciences. I started to look at urban greenhouse gas emissions and started to then move towards public health. I always like to say this, most of you have already heard it multiple times, but about 3 or 4 months before graduating with my PhD, I realized that about 50% of people do not believe in climate change. at least here in the US, but 100% believe in lung cancer, which is why I gravitated towards moving my research towards public health. And then finally, really, the ultimate goal is to look at enactable policy that we can develop so that our science doesn't just stop at science, but actually has some purpose that actually gets developed and actually gets implemented.
And I'm Dr. Tabitha Benney. I'm a professor in the political science department and also affiliated faculty in GCSE as well as the environmental studies program here at the U. When I came to the U in 2013, I was interested in vulnerable communities abroad. I was studying international political economy and really looking at the intersection of air quality and energy and how it was affecting, how policies related to these topics were affecting vulnerable populations, mainly in Southeast Asia. And I remember the first time I attended one of Daniel's talks, I had been working on a grant that morning where we were looking at poor air quality and how it was impacting communities in Nepal and Bhutan. And having worked on the grant that morning, I attended Daniel's talk, and I remember his slides, the figures on the slides were replicating the numbers I had seen in this developing country just this morning. And I remember it really ignited a passion in me to wonder why in a large city like ours here in the United States, we might be having air quality impacts like that. And if people were really aware of the long-term damage that could be caused by air quality. And I began sort of hounding Daniel to sort of incorporate me more and begin working together to try and figure out how we could look at this problem from various perspectives. We first worked with a small group of interdisciplinary researchers here at the U looking at how air pollution was impacting vulnerable student populations. And we started developing a capacity towards understanding how vulnerable populations might be impacted and how health disparities locally might be harming our society. Shortly after that, we developed a team of researchers here, a transdisciplinary team of very talented researchers here at the U. We have a medical doctor, an epidemiologist. We work with engineers, atmospheric scientists, and a variety of undergraduate and graduate student researchers on this topic and trying to understand health disparities, in particular around air quality and energy, and how it might affect us all here locally in Salt Lake City. And as we developed that capacity, COVID-19 hit, and we began wondering how we could use our specially developed kind of group set of skills to address the problems here on a local scale. And that led us to think quite closely as we saw the emerging research on COVID-19. We began to see that many of the policies were suggesting not only that minority populations were being impacted at greater rates by COVID-19, but that in fact the policies that were being enacted, the lockdown policies that were being enacted might actually be skewing them into even greater risk levels. And that was concerning for a variety of reasons. One, here in Salt Lake City, we're very lucky to have a very broad set of sensor networks and a lot of information to be able to track very precisely the impact of different factors at the local community level. And we found that that structural inequality and types of inequality need to be studied at very low levels of granularity to fully understand the mechanisms that were occurring. And this led us to ask, how have social distancing policies enacted in the spring of 2020 under the pandemic, how have they impacted the rates of COVID-19 at the community level, at the zip code level? And we began to focus on the mechanisms that might be at play that a lot of the literature was unable to answer at that time. We hypothesized essentially that some groups in society were contracting COVID-19 more likely because of compounding factors of structural inequality. So let me take a minute to sort of stop and think about this notion of structural inequality. Not everyone's familiar with it, but structural inequality is really a system of privilege that's created by the institutions and social norms that surround us in society. When we think about how government or media might impact our understanding of the world and how it might socialize us to create policies that reflect this. Education policy, land use policies, or even things like healthcare policies are really a reflection of how we come together as a society and how we define our place within society. But research on structural inequality has really been focused on the processes and the consequences of these structures that are created in society and how they intersect with things like racial or ethnic minority status, class, income, gender, education, and even occupation can play a role in how or where we're placed within the structures that are created in society. And inequality is structural when policies produced by this system keep some groups from getting ahead more than others. And this type of inequality can be pretty harmful in society for a variety of reasons. We can think of it from as being economically inefficient. We can think of it as producing conflict within society because it creates a less productive workforce. But to be honest, it really stops individuals from reaching their greatest potential. And that can be diminishing in terms of ambition to individuals, as we all know. There are two well-established ways that we understand structural inequality as sort of preventing or impacting inequality. And this has been well established since the early 90s, at least. But essentially, structural inequality is that sort of structural impact on the individual. So making them more or less productive in society is sort of the main way that we see this impact. Through the advantages and disadvantages of the position produced, we can also see that individuals are given an unequal starting point. And those two items combine together to sort of prevent people from reaching their potential. So when either situation occurs, properties of the individual's position in society end up determining their income and other rewards independently of their ability or their actions. So it doesn't matter how hard they work, they're prevented from benefiting overall. And together, these structures create relational patterns about how we see ourselves and how others see where we belong within society. So when the study of health disparities has been pretty vocal in determining or sort of showing that there's a range of relating compounding factors that may sort of cause economically disadvantaged populations from facing or making them face more of these sort of health challenges. These things can be confounded dramatically by structural factors. Maybe where you're born. If you're born near a highly polluted area, for example, it could be compounded by, say, how educated you are, even making you aware of your situation and whether you can do things to counteract that. So these things sort of layer on top of each other and create huge health disparities within society that are quite well established. But we also were considering the notion of the essential worker. It had become well known that essential workers were at greater risk of contracting COVID-19, but we wanted to think of the role of occupation in disease transmission as well. And so we reasoned that individuals in lower income brackets might be required to go to work even during lockdowns. And this became an important factor for us to consider. So how might some communities be impacted because of the type of occupation that they have during the pandemic? It's not easy to just stay home. You weren't able to quit your job during the pandemic. And so this also was quite interesting to us in terms of structural inequality. So as a result, we thought it would be appropriate to investigate how structural factors combined to create mechanisms that aided in the transmission of COVID-19 itself and how that might be applied to other urban settings. So our research questions or propositions we developed as a team were fairly simple, but quite powerful overall in the end. We began by basically asking, first of all, if the lockdown policies that were put in place during the pandemic, if they actually kept people at home. We really had no way of knowing that prior to doing this study, if people really reacted to the policy in the way that they intended. Our second proposition then extended on that notion and asked if some people, if some neighborhoods or some communities were able to stay home more than others. And this is really to see if vulnerable populations or even if low-income communities might be impacted more by the policy over others. The third proposition we thought about at that point was whether traffic mobility or this notion of staying at home or going out during the lockdown period of the pandemic, if it was associated with higher COVID-19 rates, or if other factors might be at play. So on top of this, we overlaid patterns of income, race, and occupation data at the zip code level here in Salt Lake County to see how these overlaid on top of each other to look at the structural factors of inequality and how it also might play a part in this story. Daniel?
So in terms of our project overview, we were looking at Utah's Stay Safe, Stay Home directive, it's commonly considered the lockdown period. So we looked at the period starting February 17th and ending on June 12th. So between February 17th to March 15th we could almost consider business as usual. The lockdown period really started on March 15th, went all the way through the end of April, and then afterwards, we had the post-SSSH period, which was from May through the middle of June. As a description of our study area, we all are fairly familiar with Salt Lake County. We wanted to use this as a case study because it is an urban setting. It's an urban setting with 1.16 million inhabitants. It's also really the heart of the Wasatch Front. For those of you who are not familiar with Utah, Wasatch Front is really where the majority of the population of Utah lives. Anywhere between around 80 to 90% of the population lives in that 9-county area, and we are at the center of it. We have a large immigrant population, so we do have large pockets of diversity, and there's a wide range of income levels. And as Tabitha mentioned earlier, we do have a state-of-the-art air quality sensor network, as well as a large amount of traffic count data. As I mentioned, that's our study timeline. I wanted to just keep that up there for a second, so that way we were on the same page. From middle of February to middle of March was prior to the stay home directive. Then from March to April, we had the stay safe and stay home period, and then we also had the period following that. Our statistical methods, we use Critical Wireless rank some tests to really quantify the difference in median traffic to try to understand whether there was really a difference between our study groups. And then we tested with a Wilkinson rank some tests to test for statistical significance. In terms of the results, our first proposition, does the Stay Safe, Stay Home directive keep people at home as intended? And what we wanted to do here was to look at different specific areas. We looked at hospitals, and by the way, the color bars here is that light blue grayish is what was the change from business as usual, let's say, to the lockdown. The red was, we can almost consider that the rebound after the lockdown, and then the green is the net change. And just to clarify, the red bar is from the lockdown levels, the increase from the lockdown levels to the post-lockdown levels. And as we can see, as expected, throughout the lockdown, we had a drop of anywhere between 30 to almost 45% in terms of traffic. We all saw that here in Salt Lake County. Everyone's commutes, those who had to commute, were cut in at least half. And it was, we saw many effects. We're not going to discuss those here in this presentation, but we all know how much our air quality improved. And there were some interesting side effects. Those are for another setting. And then we saw a rebound as well. When we looked at the warehouse stores, that was a really interesting process because these are averages for the entire study periods. But we did see, and then we had some funny names for them. For example, the mad rush for toilet paper. We could see the spikes when places like, for example, Walmart's, Costco, Sam's Clubs, they were just flooded when people had a panic attack. Essentially, it was the first Saturday of the lockdown where people just all scrambled to try to get their rolls of toilet paper. We also saw, and we started to look at economic impacts, such as, for example, people wanting to garden, and then we saw another spike right around that. So there are many interesting side projects that we'd like to follow, but this is really just paints a clear picture that everywhere there was a drop, and then there was a followed by a rebound. And still, even through that period, there wasn't a net, there was a net decrease compared to previous lockdown. So we know that these are sort of lasting effects at least. Now, this is definitely much more numbers than I would like to see in any PowerPoint slide. It's just here for the interest of completeness. So I would just suggest you look at the highlighted ones where we looked at, does it benefit all populations equally? And what we did was we broke up, there are 34 study zip codes that we had here in Salt Lake County. And so we broke them up into groups of 7, and then the middle zip code was a group of 6. And these groups are essentially ranked by increase in terms of either income, percent white population, or percent white collar. So if we were to look at, let's call it typical metrics, group number 1 is the most disadvantaged. Group number 5 is traditionally has been found to be the most advantaged, either higher income, higher percent white collar, higher percent white population. And we do see that this is essentially a comparison among all of the groups. And we can see that the best indicator, at least statistically, is the income group, where we could see that there are significant differences. For example, when we compare group number 1, which we see as the lowest income group, to the highest income groups 4 and 5, we can see on the top left. So overall, we did find statistical significance in many of these comparisons, especially as I mentioned during when we're comparing the most extreme groups. And then I also wanted to point out that all groups do not have similar COVID-19 rates. This is really our most stark comparison. For this example, I just wanted to not crowd the slides, and I just wanted to show one of the comparisons, which is the income group, because again, it's the one that has most statistical significance. We can first of all see the stark differences in income. We can see that the lowest income group, the median per capita income is just under $20,000 a year, but the highest income group, it's almost double that. So we can see that there's already a large divergence in terms of income, even when we aggregate and we average across the zip codes that compose that group. And what we can see is, well, first of all, the red line, which is the lowest income group, has almost 10 times the rate of positive COVID-19 cases per 100,000 population. You have to normalize that because zip codes have different populations compared to the highest 2 income groups. What's been an interesting pattern is that this repeats itself, meaning the lowest income group or the lowest percent white population or the lowest percent white collar workers is really isolated, and it tends to have nearly an order of magnitude difference in terms of any of these metrics. And then groups 4 and 5 tend to cluster together. Groups 2 and 3 also cluster together, as we could almost consider that the middle class, and then the higher income brackets, they all are fairly similar. So just for comparison, we could see we listed the start and the end of the lockdown period there with the vertical bars. Again, before the lockdown, there wasn't a high rate of contagion, but we could really see how it starts to diverge. The lockdown, as Tabitha very accurately mentioned, affects everyone very differently. So even during the lockdown period, the effects were very different in terms of the contagion rate. So the populations were not affected equally. And lastly, just so we can get a picture of this is a geographical distribution of the outcomes. These are study groups. This is Salt Lake County. There are a few zip codes there that have not been colored. Those is because either we did not have enough data on them, or they were fortunate and had no contagion of COVID-19 throughout the study period. But what we can see is that all 3 sociodemographic variables are fairly clustered together, as we all are very familiar with. The east side is generally wealthier, higher percent white population, higher percent of white collar groups, and the west side is the opposite. There's very little variability between that when we look at it geographically.
So when our group began to note the findings that we were, producing, it became pretty clear that there were a big disparity in what we were finding. I think the most important finding, of course, of this research has been the clear but nuanced relationship between traffic mobility under the lockdown period and race, income, and occupation, and how that relates to COVID-19 outcomes. We found, for example, that higher income, higher percent white, and higher white collar zip codes had a greater response to the local stay-at-home order and reduced their traffic by nearly 50% during the lockdown. That was contradicted, of course, by what we found in the low-income communities. The least affluent zip codes only had about a 15% decrease overall in the in the traffic mobility. Yet they had COVID-19 rates at an order of, I think Daniel said, around 19 times the rate of other communities, just here in our very small city. At this level of granularity, income and occupation were both highly predictive of COVID-19 across all three stages of the policy period. So even in the pre-lockdown period, the lockdown period, and the post-lockdown period, we were finding that race was not the strongest confounding factor, but rather occupation and income together in the earlier periods was much more predictive. And then when race was added in the post-lockdown period, it produced the highest correlation towards COVID-19 outcomes. And most importantly, the increased variability in traffic patterns found in the second and third policy periods suggests that the SSSH directive, it really had limited impact on some of the neighborhoods. At rates much lower than others, the vulnerable groups in society were actually impacted in a negative way by the lockdown policy. So our findings really help to illuminate some important mechanisms about how structural inequality can impact not just vulnerable populations, but everyone in society, considering how important the spread of COVID and controlling the spread of COVID is to everyone in terms of ending the pandemic itself. I think the illustrations here in our talk also show the importance of the granularity of the level of the data that we're using. Going to the zip code level really helped to show that variability in the mechanisms of how COVID was being spread, especially in terms of how the policy may have played a role in the spread of COVID-19. Zip code level data was able to show that income and occupation were relevant in ways we had not expected, and structural factors in tandem were the most likely to produce the outcomes that we were trying to investigate. When aggregated, we found that the zip code level analysis was critical in exposing these patterns, and that we presented a more complete and accurate picture of what was going on in our local community by moving down to these levels and considering important factors that were related to structural inequality overall. Based off this research, we can conclude that government policies to prevent the spread of COVID-19 may have had a factor in the variability we found in human mobility. It may have also played a part in explaining the transmission of COVID-19 here in our local community. And based on this analysis, we can conclude that the SSH policy had a weak benefit on the less affluent zip codes in Salt Lake County, but had a substantial benefit for the most affluent communities, which is obviously not the main attempt of the policy itself. This is important because we have to understand these sorts of structural inequality issues in terms of generating policies that more effectively benefit our community overall. Race was also not as strong of a determinant of COVID-19 in our community as it has been found in other communities. We found that low-income communities more generally were a better sort of variable for understanding the spread of COVID-19 locally. And upon easing of the policy, more affluent communities rebounded quicker than low-income communities. And that was also an important finding, although further research would be necessary to understand exactly why that happened. We speculated that more affluent communities were able to stay home and therefore were less likely to be exposed to the risk to begin with, and therefore were healthier overall in general terms and able to rebound as a result of that following the lockdown more quickly. And by exploring these compounding factors of the zip code level, we've really begun to illustrate how human mobility under the pandemic has help to facilitate disease transmission in ways we didn't expect. This has been an important finding locally, and one that we hope to develop a little bit more and research a bit further down the line. But findings like this help to clarify the role of structural inequality in society and how it plays an important role in explaining the incidence of COVID-19 and other types of disease transmission in society, and addressing compounding factors such as structural inequality and the related factors of structural inequality clearly serve to benefit everybody in society. So unwinding these important problems will require everyone to be more aware of these problems and for policies to be designed with these types of policies in mind to help benefit everyone more equally as a result of the policies themselves. So we wanted to add this slide about doing interdisciplinary research. Over the past 2 years, as our team has begun to sort of grow and develop this capacity of working together and coming from such different areas of science, we found our work from interdisciplinary research to be extremely fruitful and quite encouraging, actually, especially our ability to move quickly into a new topic like COVID-19 and address the problems of vulnerable populations was exceptionally rewarding for, I think, everyone on our team. It really brought a lot of fresh eyes and innovation to the topics we were studying, and we've learned a lot from working together, not only about air quality and about disease and health disparities, but how other communities or other research communities address and work at solving problems like this. In social sciences, myself as someone who comes from social sciences, having access to this level and quality of data was quite eye-opening. It's not something we often get to do. And on the flip side of that, I think the introduction of social variables like income and race into the more natural sciences and medical sciences that the other researchers on our team were exploring, I think that was really fruitful for them as well and produced some quite astounding and interesting outcomes as a result of combining and learning how to work together at both opposite ends of that data spectrum. The research methods were interesting to all of us as well. We all fluently could speak well across our research methods. They were a unifying language for all of us. So that encourages us in a variety of ways, both in terms of teaching graduate students and undergraduates the value of research methods, but also in allowing others to sort of tackle big and important problems and understand that there's a common language that we can all work with in order to sort of address these sorts of problems. Of course, improved problem solving came with having a diverse team, having different research skills and having people with different research experiences was really valuable. People always had interesting solutions and interesting ideas about how to address our problems. And we really had less opportunity to stumble as a result of that. So I can really appreciate that. And it was also interesting to a wider audience. So we've been able to speak to people in a variety of fields on a variety of topics regarding our work because we come from so many different fields. And this has been especially rewarding for, I think, everyone on our team. Daniel, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that this was really, for us, it was a really great experience to work across all these disciplines, because ultimately what we want to do is we want to provide a well-rounded research topic that is translatable across many disciplines. We can see how several of members of our team can actually take some of these lessons to develop in their own personal research as well. So it's been very gratifying and a great opportunity.
Yeah, so thank you. We're happy to take some questions if people have some.
Well, Tabitha and Daniel, thank you very much. I think we're getting a little chatter in the background. If I could just remind people to maybe mute themselves. So we have plenty of time for questions. Let me just check the chat box. I'm now seeing some new ones just since I started talking. This is from Aaron. I'm sorry, your name is truncated. Sorry. So the question is, do you think similar results will be observed using aerial units with less variability, such as census tracts? It would be interesting to get your thoughts about transportation, using public transit versus having your own vehicle, and how that might play in the inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to just?
I can take a stab at it, and then Tabitha can fill in as well. Part of the reason why we chose zip codes is because that was readily available data within the Salt Lake County Health Department. The majority of our data in terms of the COVID-19 rates was obtained from the Salt Lake County Health Department's COVID-19 dashboard. That is the finest resolution that is available. And I think for privacy reasons, particularly in areas such as rural Utah, where there may be very few people really residing within, say, a census block group or anything smaller than a zip code, for privacy reasons, they actually have aggregated to a zip code level. So unfortunately, the data would be, it would be very difficult to collect in that sense. I think that it would be great to have that. And I think that, yes, with a correct IRB, we probably would be able to retrieve that kind of data, and it would really tell us a little bit more. A great example of that is if we're looking at, for example, the downtown area, because in the downtown area, we do have very large differences in terms of income. And so when you aggregate across the zip code, for example, the zip codes near the university, we have very low income members, and for example, including students who essentially have very low or zero income. And that does muddy up the signal a little bit. So I think that that's something that would be really nice if we get to, for example, census block group level. In terms of access to transportation, there are many compounding factors, and trying to disentangle that would be a great challenge. I think that what part of the reason is, of course, public transit has also changed significantly. Its scheduling, for example. And so even though there are many community members that have to rely on transit, they may actually have just had to change their transportation modality simply because I remember, I take transit generally. I haven't really changed my behavior very much. I noticed that buses, for example, at least prior to the school year starting last fall, buses had cut service in about half. Same with tracks as well, our light rail. So I think that it is interesting, and that the data is available, for example, at the Census Bureau, where we could take a look at what fraction of population within each area takes transit or rides their bike or walks or has their own personal vehicle. In terms of the contagion rate, I mean, one thing that's a little bit scary, particularly in the tracks, not so much in the bus, in this personal experience, is that many people do not obey the mask requirement, especially later on at night. If I take the track, say, and after 8 p.m., I could tell you that about half the people they've just removed their masks. And so that could potentially be, because it is an enclosed area, the ventilation is probably not, I'm sure there are probably improvements, but it may just be one of those areas where one is likely to contract COVID-19.
Yeah, we also, similarly to transportation, we could think about unemployment rates and sort of how unemployment during the lockdown period may have also played a part. Some people were quitting jobs or were unable to go to work. And so there's some of that factor as well that we might want to think about in terms of how it might be confounding the problem that we're looking at. We also looked at things like testing rates, and we did some robustness checks to make sure that testing rates, Salt Lake County actually did a great job of testing quite equally towards the beginning. That has become differential across the study period, but much later in the study period after what we're looking at in this paper in particular. But in terms of the zip code level, going to the census tract level would not have been approved by the IRB. I think we actually spoke with someone in IRB regarding that because it would be too easy to identify someone who might have COVID-19 in the study, especially in some of the zip codes where you have 1, 2, or 3 people getting COVID at a time. There was concern over whether it would lead to ethical issues. And so we refrained from moving to the census tract level quite early on and sort of felt like it would be best to sort of move away from that. But I agree that at the census level, the census tract level, there could be some even more interesting patterns at this lower level of granularity. But it was super interesting from somebody who studies policy and just never truly having access at that level to data of that quality, to think about policy at that level. It was very fruitful and something that I hope future research will pay more attention to, because it really shined the light on the patterns that we were observing and helped to explain how they were working and functioning together in ways we didn't expect.
If I could just add one thing about data, and maybe others have a similar thought about the granularity and the excuse me, the privacy of the data. And as you probably know, there are some projects that are going on where the geographic resolution is actually down to a lower level. There are certain protections, as you pointed out, Tabitha. So maybe that could be a discussion offline or after this, if there's others who are interested in following up. But there's, at least in my role up with the Utah Population Database, there is record linking to the individual level data. And there's a lot of, as I say, protection. So there may be some opportunity there that also takes into account, of course, personal privacy. But I just wanted to segue to that. Kathleen Zick did ask about whether you have thought about or are already doing something on variations in the way that you're looking at it by zip code with respect to vaccinations. Is that something on your to-do list?
So we have actually made requests to try and get the same information essentially at the zip code level for vaccinations. Daniel has been hounding people, and I've been scouring the internet and sort of trying to see if we can break down the available data. In fact, most of the data that we have for this project, we actually had to hand calculate. In the beginning, we were literally looking at newspaper articles and calculating individual COVID rates early on that way until it became public data. And so we've been trying to do similar numbers, taking screenshots of conversations we're having with people when they talk about vaccination schedules and things like that to see what we can accumulate. But it's been difficult to find very specific level data on where people are from in our community at this point on vaccination, unfortunately. We're still working on it. It's definitely the next thing on our radar in terms of this project.
Great. I'm just watching the chat box. I don't see any other questions, but I did want to ask, and this is maybe perhaps more speculation that you can offer, but maybe thoughts of how you might do this. But so we've seen in the period of time that you covered, of course, we've seen the number of cases really escalate dramatically, and some of that's being driven by social events, Thanksgiving and Christmas being primary among them. And so how do you see that part of the engine of the transmission of the disease playing into your spatial variation, where I guess the way I would say this is, like, anytime you have a thing that comes along during the COVID period and it just makes things worse, does it make it even more worse in the ways that you're describing in these different social dimensions?
Yeah, I'll say we were tracking media and sort of big media events when Donald Trump would say things about COVID-19 not being a problem and different things like that. The stock market had a big sort of crash in the middle. We had the earthquake early on as well. So we were tracking some of these sort of social events. And in particular, when the checks came out for, the first checks came out for COVID-19 relief, we actually see a big uptick in the rates of COVID, especially in the lower income communities. And it's interesting to think about how even those COVID-19 checks, they led people to go out during the lockdown period at higher rates than before. And then we see a quick uptick, of course, in COVID-19 rates following, people receiving their checks. And it was interesting that these policies were essentially contradicting each other in a sense, right? That we were giving people money to go out and spend their money, but at the same time, we were trying to keep them at home locally. And so there were some interesting contradictions like that were fascinating to think about, how they were not coordinated properly or contradicting, but also thinking about how these holidays were playing a part in things. We did further analysis on on occupation, and occupation still continued to play a really, really important role in the spread of COVID-19. So we imagine there could be a relationship between, these holiday parties and whatnot, but in particular, the people in certain occupations were probably likely, contracting it and bringing it home. And so it's interesting to think about that as well, that relationship with occupation has maintained across time. It's been an important indicator of who is actually contracting COVID-19, and policies really haven't reflected that at all. Now vaccination is reflecting that, I think, quite well. We're seeing not just essential workers, but frontline workers and blue collar workers being vaccinated very early on. Even the state of Utah has, for example, made university professors have been pushed off the vaccination scale because we're technically high income affluent workers who can stay at home and work from home. That's an advantageous situation to be in and properly situated, whether we like that or not. As faculty here at the U, we are a much lower risk of contracting COVID-19 because of the situation of where we are able to work from. And so there have been some reflections on this sort of thing, that occupation is playing an important role in ways that people need to pay attention to, and policies need to be sensitive to that. So that's been a positive, actually.
Yeah, I think, Tabitha, I think you're saying faculty are non-essential. I think is what you're trying to say.
I think we're saying we're affluent enough and privileged enough to be working from home, which is a wonderful benefit that we have, and that the vaccination should go to other low-income communities before us because of their compounding risk. And we should be gracious and that we have the privilege we have for that. So.
Great, thank you for that. I'm not seeing any more additional questions.
I have a question.
Oh, David.
Sorry,
sure.
I don't know if I should put it in the chat or if I can just ask directly.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go take the mic.
Okay, great. So yeah, great job, Daniel and Tabitha. Really good work. I was interested in the data you presented on the change in median traffic volume, and I was surprised at how similar it was across these categories. Some of the other work I've seen using different measures like Google mobility reports, didn't really show a decline from my knowledge, like for the big box warehouse stores and other specific places. Whereas, I'd expect like airport to have been even greater. Anyways, I'm just wondering what your impression is of the data quality. Were there any challenges in kind of specificity here, or again, it just seems like the patterns are too similar. They're not specific enough. So just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yes, and
it's a minor issue though, for sure.
Well, we want to clarify the data just to show that we're doing things a little bit differently. So what we did was, for example, for hospitals, we picked traffic counters near each of the major hospitals: Intermountain, Primary Children's, the U, Salt Lake Regional, St. Mark's, etc. And what we did was we really picked a traffic counter that was closest to each one of these facilities. So for example, also looked at the traffic counters closest to the Costco, Walmart, Sam's Club, etc. And then for the residential, non-residential areas, we also looked for each zip code. We looked at the traffic counter that was closest to the zip code centroid. So it's probably not as representative. It's definitely not as detailed as the studies that you've mentioned, which we're familiar with. But we really had to kind of nail down something that was tractable and that we could do. The story really for us has been mainly the residential traffic within each zip code. And that's really the story that we wanted to tell. But we wanted to show that at least across, when we look at all these different types of amenities, all these types of categories, as we call them, that there was at least one traffic counter that was representative. One of the challenges has also been that many of the traffic counters did have some data drops throughout the study period. So some of these counters are not necessarily the closest or potentially most representative. So for example, for the airport, the closest one was really on I-80, so right where one exits I-80. So it may not be as representative. That was, and I wish we would have had more time to really look at this more deeply, but that wasn't necessarily the main focus. But that's a really great observation. This does look a little bit fairly evenly distributed. And we do understand, as you said, Google Mobility, those maps are much more detailed.
So could the, just a quick follow-up regarding that then, could the lower income neighborhoods, or the other demographic categories that you used, could the residential neighborhoods be misclassified more commonly there because of commuters and urban like retail located, or do you think at least residential versus non-residential that you were able to get a pretty accurate coding? I just imagine if you're up on the benches, if you're there, you're probably there because you're a resident or whatever, maybe there's some other amenity you're going to. But if you're, downtown, maybe there's more misclassification.
Yes, that is definitely a potential danger here. We did spend significant amounts of time trying to look for something that wasn't, for example, if we're looking at a residential road, we tried to look at something that was near a neighborhood or a community, for example, because yes, the danger is through traffic. And that's why when the category that we have that's non-residential, those were generally interstates or larger arterials, because we know that there's a lot of through traffic. And for the residential, as I mentioned, we looked for the smallest roads. We looked for anything that was close to neighborhoods, for example, to try to look at that. Part of the danger, of course, is also, and we think that some of the mobility is actually underestimated for the wealthier communities, because those are the zip codes or the communities that are able to contact food delivery services or grocery delivery services. And that's a follow-up, and that's for another time. But some of the work that Tabitha and I have been developing is looking at the shift in terms of emissions related to commercial buildings and commercial clusters compared to residential clusters, because now there are less people going to offices, so the traffic is much less, not just from people commuting to work, but from delivery trucks, for example, taking either large items or even food deliveries. Those are, if the offices are empty, no one's ordering food for delivery. And now that's kind of shifting more towards homes. And it's also compounded by the building emissions, where now you no longer have to really keep those commercial buildings at 72 Fahrenheit during the winter or the summer. So there's less energy consumption, there are less emissions, and now it's shifted to the residential sector. So yes, there are many different compounding factors that and that's what we're really trying to show an association. I think that correlation is something that we've really steered away from that. We're just trying to say these are patterns that we generally are seeing, but we know that there are multiple factors that are at play here. And I think that's part of our interdisciplinary team. Part of what we want to do is not scratch the surface. That's probably underselling what we're trying to do, but really start to look at it in a more sort of holistic way, and then let the experts who do transportation or who do infectious disease, then dive into it, but within that kind of framework. So that's, I'm not trying to say we're generalists, but we're trying to make this so that everyone can understand, and then try to see if you're an expert in something, go ahead, we can collaborate with you. But this is kind of what we're seeing as an overall picture.
Yeah, I think this was really our first attempt to do sort of structural inequality. When we first began the project, the notion was we were kind of specialists in air quality and how it was affecting health disparities. And our first hunch was essentially that maybe, low income or minority populations were living near highly polluted areas, or were more likely to be impacted primarily by health disparities related to air pollution. And so initially we were wondering if there was a relationship between why they were getting COVID at higher rates was simply because they were, they were sort of predisposed to air pollution, which put them in a lower category in terms of health effects. And it was interesting as we began looking at the mobility data, if you look at it by zip code, and I wish we actually had the slide for it here, it is really eye-opening to see the individual zip codes laid out in terms of mobility. It's dramatic, the differences between the high income communities and low income communities. And even if we're over accentuating or under accentuating in either of these zip codes, still the rate of difference is so dramatic that there's clearly something going on here that is being drawn or driven by differences in what people have in terms of options under the pandemic. So it was pretty eye-opening, and it steered us more towards structural inequality. We began asking, why are we seeing such different rates in one zip code versus another zip code in terms of mobility? Some zip codes look like there was no lockdown period at all. It was really shocking to see the order of difference between the communities. So I should say that is, here we go. Quite, I think, important for us to think about why is this happening, regardless of, the representation of the data and the quality of the data. The other part is many of the studies that are done at the zip code level that we have found have been cross-sectional, or they're not capturing the entire community. So this was really the first attempt that we had seen to do the kind of work we were doing with this granularity of data. So it was a pretty complex situation to be mapping, especially under the pandemic.
Would you mind just setting up the axes and just walk us through this graph for everybody? I know I've seen this, but if you could just describe it, because the font is a little.
Oh yeah, so this is I call it the tail two zip codes. This is the traffic variability during stay-at-home directives. We can see we've drawn blue and red lines, and that highlights between the blue and the red lines is the lockdown period. These are two extreme zip codes, 84104, that is Glendale area. And as you can see, a per capita income is nearly a third of 84105, which is Yellcrest area, which is very affluent. It's, for those of you who are not familiar with the neighborhood, is between essentially the U and Sugar House. And you can also see Glendale actually has the highest diversity in terms of race in the whole state. It's a zip code that's the most diverse. And Yellcrest has a little bit less diversity. And why we picked these two zip codes, besides the fact that they're almost at the extremes, is that they had fairly similar peaks in terms of their hourly traffic pre-pandemic. Another thing, I mean, if you squint really, really hard, you can kind of see that the peak traffic, it really on 84105 in Yellcrest, is really mostly during the daytime, whereas there's still traffic in the evenings in Glendale. That really kind of shows that workers there actually work second and third shift. This is pre-pandemic. And then during the pandemic, the traffic here in 84104 dropped by about 15% roughly. Here in the Yellcrest area dropped by about 50%. And so this is really one of our most extreme cases, and that's when we were showing. These are, again, the raw hourly traffic counts. And then you can see the rebound coming up on the Yellcrest area, whereas the rebound just goes right back to normal levels for 84104. So that's that really kind of shows us what's going on here.
You can also even notice in this, right prior to the blue dotted line, in the low income neighborhood, there's no abstinence at all from going out. There was really nothing stopping people from going out, and we can't assume that it was just people didn't know any better, right? That would be completely illegitimate to think about that. It's rather people are still going to work despite the pandemic and despite the risk that they might be facing, generally because they're hourly or part-time workers or working multiple jobs possibly. And this is what led us to think about occupation, was trying to explain why even, once the pandemic began and we saw natural declines in other zip codes, why we didn't see that in the lowest income neighborhoods. And this was a pattern that was common across all the lowest income neighborhoods. They themselves had a very unique pattern, even from the next income grouping that we had. The lowest income patterns really were quite unaffected by these policies in a variety of ways. And it was impactful to us as a team.
Okay, well, this is really fascinating, and thank you for, we're getting close to the end of our hour, and I want to thank Tabitha and Daniel for a great presentation on a really important topic, and for illustrating, as you have pointed out a few times, the value and some challenges of doing interdisciplinary work, which is something Nexus, of course, is doing its best to encourage on campus. So, and then with respect to your topic, hopefully people can reach out to you afterwards And then I would just also, again, repeat the fact that there are some other great data that you might be able to take advantage of that that I think would add strength to your really amazing study. So I think we can all give a virtual applause to Daniel and Tabitha. And we don't have a balloon drop or confetti gun for you, but we can do this. So thank you again for taking the time. And then so we'll be putting out notices for our next talk, and Tabitha and Daniel have set a high bar. So challenge for the upcoming speakers. So thank you, everybody. And again, thank you, Tabitha and Daniel. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting us. We appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks for the opportunity and for everyone who took your lunch hour to be with us.
Okay, very good. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.